The crystalline chamber of the Galactic Council stretched impossibly high, its walls pulsing with bioluminescent veins that cast shifting shadows across the assembled delegates. Commander Jessica Rice stood in the center of the Judgment Circle, her black uniform stark against the pearl-white floor. Around her, representatives from 47 species watched with expressions ranging from disgust to clinical curiosity. The Zephyrian Prime Minister's translucent form shimmered as she spoke, her voice carrying the musical quality of wind through crystal formations. "Commander Rice, you stand accused of conducting warfare in a manner that violates the civilized conduct protocols established 3 centuries ago. Your actions on Kepler 442b have been deemed barbaric by this council's standards." Jessica's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She had expected this. The moment her ship had returned from the outer rim, she knew the political machinery would be waiting. The rescue of the Antarian research station had been successful. All 847 researchers evacuated safely, but the methods had been unconventional by galactic standards. "The charges are specific," continued the Prime Minister, consulting a holographic display that materialized before her ethereal fingers. "Use of improvised explosive devices constructed from mining equipment, hand-to-hand combat with indigenous predators, deliberate destruction of ecosystem balance to create tactical advantages, and most concerning," her voice dropped to emphasize the gravity, "the intentional psychological terrorization of hostile forces." A murmur rippled through the assembly. The Centauran delegates' 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of deep displeasure. The Vegan representatives' scaled skin shifted from blue to deep purple, their species equivalent of a disapproving frown. Even the usually neutral Arctican observers leaned forward in their floating pods, their interest piqued. Jessica remained motionless, her green eyes scanning the crowd. She had served in the Galactic Defense Force for 12 years, worked alongside most of these species, saved lives from dozens of worlds. Yet here she stood, being judged by beings who had never felt dirt under their fingernails or tasted blood in their mouths. "The evidence is overwhelming," the Zephyrian continued. "Orbital surveillance recorded your team's activities in detail. The indigenous Keplerian ravagers, a species that had maintained territorial balance for millennia, were driven into a panic response that resulted in massive environmental disruption. Your methods were—" She paused, searching for the right word in standard galactic, "primitive." The Centauran delegate rose on his 4 powerful legs, his voice booming across the chamber. "Prime Minister, if I may, the humans' actions represent everything we have tried to evolve beyond in our collective civilization. The use of crude explosives, the reliance on violence as a first resort, the complete disregard for ecological harmony, these are the hallmarks of a species that hasn't yet learned to think beyond base survival instincts." Agreement rumbled through various sections of the assembly. The Alterans clicked their mandibles in approval. The Danebian collective pulsed their shared consciousness in unified disapproval, their bioluminescent patches synchronizing to create a wave of condemnation. "Furthermore," the Centauran continued, his tone growing more accusatory, "intelligence reports suggest that Commander Rice actually seemed to enjoy the violence. Witnesses among her own crew reported hearing her laugh during combat encounters. What civilized being finds joy in inflicting terror?" Jessica's hands, clasped behind her back, tightened slightly. She remembered that moment, the point when the Ravagers had surrounded her team in the underground caverns, their razor-sharp claws clicking against stone, their phosphorescent eyes gleaming in the darkness. She remembered the improvised explosive device she had constructed from mining charges and a medical scanner's power core. She remembered the look of confusion and fear in those alien eyes when the tunnel collapsed, cutting off their retreat route. And yes, she remembered laughing, not from cruelty, but from the pure, electric rush of being alive when death had seemed certain. The Vegan representative's melodious voice filled the chamber. In our 50,000 years of recorded history, we have found that violence breeds only more violence. The Keplerian ecosystem will take decades to recover from the disruption caused by these savage tactics. How does one justify such collateral damage? The Antarian researchers were facing certain death, Jessica said quietly, speaking for the first time since the proceedings began. Her voice carried clearly through the chamber's acoustic design, though she hadn't raised it above conversational level. "Death is part of the natural order," replied the Altaran delegate, his insectoid head tilting at an angle that suggested philosophical contemplation. To disrupt an entire ecosystem to prevent a few deaths shows a concerning inability to accept the greater cosmic balance. The Arcturian observer's mechanical translation unit crackled to life. Analysis indicates that alternative solutions existed. Diplomatic contact with the Ravagers could have been established. Territorial agreements could have been negotiated. The human chose violence as the primary option, suggesting cognitive limitations consistent with pre-spaceflight evolutionary development. Jessica felt the familiar weight of condescension settling over the chamber like a fog. It was the same tone she had heard throughout her career, the gentle, patient voice of advanced civilizations explaining to the violent little humans why their instincts were wrong, why their solutions were crude, why their very nature was somehow shameful. The Zephyrian Prime Minister's form solidified slightly, indicating the formal transition to judgment phase. "Commander Rice, before this council renders its decision regarding your continued service in the Galactic Defense Force, you have the right to speak in your defense. However, I must warn you that your record shows a pattern of similar incidents. The Rigel Station incident 3 years ago, the Tau Ceti evacuation, the defense of the Proxima mining facility. In each case, your methods were questionable." Jessica stepped forward slightly, her boots clicking once against the crystalline floor. The sound seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed, as if the chamber itself was holding its breath. "You want to know about barbarism?" she asked, her voice still quiet but carrying a new edge. "You want to understand savage tactics?" The assembly settled into absolute silence. Even the Danebian collective stopped their subtle pulsing, their shared consciousness focused entirely on the human standing in their judgment circle. Jessica's eyes moved slowly across the assembled delegates, meeting the gaze of species that had evolved beyond the need for violence, beyond the instinct for survival at any cost. Their civilizations had grown in safety, protected by distance, by powerful shields, by the luxury of time to develop philosophical approaches to conflict. "The Antarian Research Station," she continued, "was built on Kepler 442b because your collective wisdom determined it was uninhabited by sentient life. The Ravagers didn't register on your sensors because they live primarily underground, and their neural patterns don't match your definition of intelligence. They're what you might call barely evolved." The Centauran delegate's eyes narrowed. The preliminary surveys were thorough. The planet showed no signs of advanced civilization. "Advanced by whose standards?" Jessica asked. The Ravagers had been using those cave systems for hunting runs that followed seasonal patterns developed over thousands of years. They had territorial boundaries, communication systems, and social hierarchies, but because they didn't build cities or broadcast radio signals, your surveys classified them as wildlife. A ripple of discomfort moved through the assembly. The Vegan representative's scales shifted to a muted gray, uncertainty. "When the station was established," Jessica continued, "it disrupted migration routes that the Ravagers had used for generations. The mining operations changed the acoustic properties of their underground territories. Your researchers never noticed because they were focused on their atmospheric studies, not on the life they were displacing." The Altaran delegate's mandibles clicked impatiently. Even accepting your interpretation, violence was not the appropriate response. Negotiation, relocation assistance, technological solutions. "How long would negotiations have taken?" Jessica interrupted. The Ravagers had already begun their coordinated assault. 7 researchers were dead within the first hour. The station's defenses were designed to keep out weather and equipment malfunctions, not a coordinated attack by creatures with natural camouflage and climbing abilities that exceeded your projections. She paused, letting the silence build before continuing. Your response team was 3 days away. The Antarian evacuation shuttles couldn't land because the Ravagers had learned to use their sonic calls to interfere with navigation systems. Every minute we debated ethics was another life lost. The Arcturian Observer's translation unit hummed. Statistical analysis suggests that acceptable losses should have been calculated against ecosystem disruption. The needs of many outweigh the needs of few. Jessica's laugh was short and sharp, lacking any humor. Acceptable losses. You want to reduce 847 sentient beings to an acceptable statistic. Tell me, Observer, what percentage of casualties makes intervention worthwhile? 10%? 50%? All of them. The point, interjected the Zephyrian Prime Minister, her form beginning to show stress patterns in its crystalline structure, is that your methods showed complete disregard for civilized standards of conflict resolution. The explosive devices you constructed were crude and dangerous. The ecological damage was necessary, Jessica finished. The Ravagers hunt in pack formations. They use the underground tunnels as highways, moving in coordinated groups to surround prey. Standard defensive positions would have been useless because they could approach from any direction, including directly below. She gestured to the holographic display that still showed footage from the rescue operation. The explosives weren't weapons, they were construction tools. I collapsed specific tunnel sections to create choke points, forcing the Ravagers to approach from predictable directions. It gave my team the tactical advantage we needed to establish a defensive perimeter while the evacuation proceeded. The Danubian collective pulsed in what their species considered deep thought. Their shared consciousness allowed them to process multiple perspectives simultaneously, but it also meant they rarely understood the necessity of individual, split-second decisions. But the hand-to-hand combat, one of their speakers finally said, the voice carrying the harmonized tone of their group mind. The recordings show you engaging the Ravagers with primitive weapons, knives, improvised clubs. Such methods are beneath civilized behavior. Jessica's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle straightening, a slight widening of her stance. Those who knew human body language might have recognized it as the preparation for combat. My rifle's power cell was damaged during the tunnel collapse. Standard-issue plasma weapons require specific energy frequencies that the debris had disrupted. I had 2 options: retreat and abandon the researchers still trapped in the outer laboratory sections, or adapt. She reached behind her back and drew a carbon steel knife, its blade worn but perfectly maintained. The sight of the weapon sent a shock through the assembly. Several delegates actually recoiled, their evolutionary conditioning making them instinctively fear the primitive implement. This blade, Jessica said, holding it up so the chamber's bioluminescent lighting reflected off the edge, belonged to my grandfather. He carried it through the Earth-Mars conflicts, the Titan rebellions, and the First Contact Wars. It doesn't require power cells or atmospheric conditions or technological support. It works because it's simple, because it's been tested by 10,000 years of human survival. The Centauran delegate's 4 legs shifted nervously. Commander, weapons are forbidden in the council chamber. This isn't a weapon, Jessica replied, sliding the knife back into its sheath. It's a tool. The difference is in how you use it. The Vegan representative's scales had shifted to deep orange, alarm mixed with curiosity. You speak of survival as if it justifies any action. Civilized beings have moved beyond such base considerations. Jessica's smile was sharp enough to cut. Have you? When was the last time your species faced extinction? When did you last have to choose between compromise and annihilation? The question hung in the air like a challenge. The assembled delegates had spent centuries debating ethics and philosophy from positions of safety and abundance. Their civilizations had evolved in protected environments, guided by advanced technologies and supported by vast resources. The Vegan homeworld, Jessica continued, has been stable for 15,000 years. Your population has never exceeded your planet's carrying capacity. Your resources have never been scarce enough to create genuine conflict. You've had the luxury of developing non-violent solutions because violence has never been necessary for your survival. She turned to face the Centauran delegate. Your species evolved on a world where the primary predators were slow-moving and easily avoided. Your four-legged physiology gave you natural advantages in running and climbing. You never had to learn to fight because you could always escape. The delegate's skin color shifted to a deeper shade. Embarrassment or anger, it was difficult to tell with their species. And the Alterans, Jessica continued, her gaze moving to the insectoid representative, developed in a hive-based society where cooperation was instinctual. Individual survival was never an issue because the collective always provided protection and resources. The Alteran's mandibles clicked rapidly, defensive agitation. You judge humans for being violent, Jessica said, her voice growing stronger, more forceful. You call us barbaric, savage, primitive, but your civilizations have never been tested. You've never faced a situation where every choice leads to death, where the only question is how many will die and how much suffering can be prevented. The Arcturian observer's mechanical systems whirred as it processed this information. Its species had long ago transcended biological form, uploading their consciousness into quantum computational matrices that could exist for millennia without physical vulnerability. The concept of immediate physical threat was purely theoretical to them. You speak as if violence is inevitable, the observer's translated voice crackled through the chamber. Surely intelligence should allow for the transcendence of such primitive responses. Jessica's eyes found the floating pod that contained the Arcturian's consciousness. Intelligence doesn't eliminate the need for survival, it just makes you better at it. Your species chose transcendence because your biological forms were too fragile to survive on your homeworld after your son began dying. You didn't evolve beyond violence. You escaped the need for it by abandoning physical existence entirely. The observation struck the assembly like a physical blow. The Arcturian's pod bobbed slightly, the equivalent of taking a step backward. The difference between humans and the rest of you, Jessica continued, is that we never had the option of escape. Earth wasn't a garden world. Our evolution was shaped by ice ages, volcanic eruptions, predators that hunted us for food, diseases that could wipe out entire populations. We learned to fight because the alternative was extinction. She gestured toward the holographic display. The recordings you've shown as evidence of my barbarism. Let me tell you what you're really seeing. The image shifted, showing Jessica in the underground caverns of Kepler 442b. The lighting was poor, emergency illumination casting harsh shadows as she moved through corridors filled with the bodies of researchers who hadn't made it to the evacuation zones. That moment when I'm constructing the explosive device, Jessica said, pointing to herself in the recording. I had just found Dr. Reeves from the atmospheric analysis team. The Ravagers had cornered him in a storage closet. He was still alive when I got there, but barely. His last words were about his daughter's graduation ceremony, something he was supposed to attend when the research rotation ended. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft hum of life support systems. The laugh you mentioned, Jessica continued, happened 30 seconds later when the tunnel collapse worked exactly as I had calculated. I wasn't laughing at the Ravager's fear. I was laughing because for the first time in 6 hours, I had managed to save someone instead of just finding their body. The Centauran delegate's massive form shifted uncomfortably, but the ecological damage will heal, Jessica cut him off. Ecosystems are resilient. They adapt, they recover, they find new balances. The 847 researchers I evacuated won't heal if they're dead. They won't adapt or recover or find new balances. They'll just be gone. The Denebian collective pulsed in their characteristic pattern of deep consideration. As a group consciousness, they understood the value of individual life differently than most species, but they also grasped the mathematics of collective survival. The Ravagers, one of their speakers said, showed sophisticated tactical coordination. Our analysis suggests they were capable of learning and adaptation. Could they not have been reasoned with? Jessica's expression hardened. 3 of my team members tried exactly that approach. Lieutenant Torres was a xenobiologist with extensive experience in first contact protocols. She spent 2 hours attempting to establish communication while the Ravagers systematically hunted down researchers in the outer sectors. The holographic display shifted again, showing grainy footage of a young woman in a damaged uniform making hand gestures and sound patterns while shadowy forms moved through the background. Torres died trying to create a peaceful solution. The Ravagers understood her intentions perfectly. They just didn't care. From their perspective, we were invaders who had disrupted their territory and needed to be eliminated. No amount of diplomatic gesture was going to change that basic fact. The vegan representative's scales had shifted to a pale yellow, anxiety mixed with dawning understanding. But surely there were other options. Technology could have provided— What technology? Jessica asked sharply. The station's communication array was damaged in the first attack. The defensive systems had been designed for weather protection, not coordinated assault by indigenous life forms. The evacuation shuttles couldn't maintain stable landing approaches because of sonic interference from the Ravagers' hunting calls. She paused, letting the reality sink in before continuing. We had what we carried, what we could improvise, and what we could salvage from the wreckage. No orbital support, no reinforcements, no advanced technological solutions. Just human ingenuity and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to save lives. The Alteran delegate's head tilted in the gesture his species used to indicate complex consideration. Your actions suggest a concerning comfort with violence as a problem-solving method. Jessica's smile was grim. Violence isn't a problem-solving method. It's a last resort when all other methods have failed or when time doesn't allow for alternatives. The difference is that humans understand the distinction between necessary violence and unnecessary violence. She walked closer to the assembled delegates, her movement fluid and controlled. Several representatives instinctively shifted away from her approach, an involuntary response to the predator grace that was part of human evolutionary heritage. Every species in this chamber has benefited from human military service, Jessica said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. The vegan trade routes are protected by human patrol fleets. The Centauran research stations in hostile environments are defended by human security forces. The Alteran colony worlds rely on human peacekeepers to maintain order. The accusations hit their targets with visible impact. The vegan representative's scales flickered through several colors in rapid succession. The Centauran delegate's massive head lowered slightly, a gesture of uncomfortable acknowledgement. You contract us to handle the situations that your civilizations can't stomach, Jessica continued relentlessly. When pirates threaten shipping lanes, you call humans. When hostile alien species attack your settlements, you call humans. When your carefully planned colonization efforts encounter unexpected dangers, you call humans. The Zephyrian Prime Minister's crystalline form showed stress fractures, hairline cracks that indicated extreme tension. Commander Rice, this council has always appreciated human military capabilities. No, Jessica interrupted, her voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. You've tolerated human military capabilities because they're useful to you, but you've never understood them, never respected them, and never acknowledged what they cost. She gestured toward her uniform, toward the ribbons and decorations that marked years of service across dozens of worlds and conflicts. Every medal here represents a situation where human barbarism saved lives that your advanced civilizations couldn't protect. Every campaign ribbon marks a world where human savagery preserved the peace that allows you to sit in this chamber and debate ethics. The Arcturian observer systems hummed with increased activity. Are you suggesting that violence is morally superior to peaceful resolution? Jessica's laugh was bitter. I'm suggesting that moral superiority is a luxury that requires someone else to handle the violence for you. Your peaceful civilization exists because humans are willing to be savage when savage is what the situation requires. The chamber's bioluminescent walls pulsed with increased intensity, responding to the elevated emotional states of the assembled delegates. The light cast shifting patterns across Jessica's uniform, highlighting the weathered fabric and the scars visible on her hands, evidence of a life spent in situations that the other species present had never had to face. The Danubian collective speaker stepped forward, their shared consciousness apparently reaching a consensus. Commander Rice, your words suggest that you view violence as not just necessary, but as a virtue. This concerns us greatly. Jessica studied the speaker's face, one of dozens of identical forms that served as physical vessels for their group mind. The concept of individual decision-making under extreme pressure was literally incomprehensible to their species. Violence isn't a virtue, Jessica replied, but the willingness to commit violence when it's necessary, that's courage. The ability to make hard choices when soft choices aren't available, that's wisdom. The strength to carry the moral weight of those choices afterward, that's honor. She turned to address the full assembly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. You call me barbaric because I used improvised explosives, but those explosives were precisely calculated to collapse specific tunnel sections without causing structural damage to the research station above. Barbarism would have been bringing down the entire complex. The Centaurian delegates' 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of confusion. The precision of violence does not eliminate its fundamental nature. Doesn't it? Jessica asked. A surgeon's scalpel causes trauma to save life. A soldier's weapon causes trauma to protect life. The tool is the same, but the intention and application make all the difference. She gestured again toward the holographic display. You've been showing selected footage of my actions on Kepler 442b. Let me show you what your edited version left out. The display flickered as Jessica activated her personal command codes, overriding the Council's control of the presentation system. New images appeared, the same caverns, the same desperate situation, but from different angles and longer time sequences. Here, Jessica said, pointing to a section of the recording, is the moment when I found a group of Ravagers trapped under debris from the tunnel collapse. Standard military doctrine would have been to eliminate them as threats. Instead, I spent 40 minutes digging them out and providing basic medical attention. The image showed Jessica, her uniform torn and bloody, carefully moving rocks and twisted metal while shadowy forms watched from nearby tunnels. Her movements were gentle, precise, the same hands that had constructed explosives now working to preserve life. And here, she continued, advancing the recording, is when I discovered that the Ravager pack attacks were being driven by territorial protection behavior. Their young were in the lower cave systems, directly beneath the research station's foundation. The new footage showed Jessica alone in a deeper tunnel, surrounded by dozens of juvenile Ravagers, creatures no larger than house cats, their phosphorescent eyes wide with fear. She moved among them slowly, making soft sounds, offering water from her emergency supplies. The Alteran delegates' mandibles had stopped their nervous clicking. You cared for their offspring? I relocated them, Jessica corrected. The adult Ravagers' aggression was instinctual. They were protecting their young from what they perceived as an invasion. Once I moved the juveniles to a safer location and marked the new territory boundaries using scent markers the adults could understand, the attacks stopped. A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembly. This information hadn't been included in the official reports. The Vegan representative's scales had shifted to deep blue, a color that indicated profound reconsideration. The report stated that you eliminated the threat through force. I neutralized the threat, Jessica said. Force was only one component of the solution. Understanding their behavior, respecting their territorial needs, and finding a way to coexist, those were equally important. The Zephyrian Prime Minister's form had stabilized, the stress fractures healing as her emotional state shifted towards something closer to confusion than condemnation. Why wasn't this included in your official mission report? Jessica's smile was sharp with bitter amusement. Because the Defense Force Evaluation Committee wanted a simple narrative. Human soldiers fight alien threats, human weapons defeat alien aggression, human victory protects civilian lives. A story about negotiating with territorial predators while simultaneously conducting combat operations was too complex for their understanding. She paused, letting the implications sink in before continuing. It's easier to label human actions as barbaric than to acknowledge that sometimes barbarism and compassion can exist in the same person, in the same moment, serving the same goals. The Arcturian observer's systems had been running continuous analysis throughout the presentation. Its translated voice carried a new tone, something that might have been uncertainty. The complexity of human decision-making patterns appears to exceed our predictive models. Because you've been trying to reduce us to simple variables, Jessica replied. Violent or peaceful, savage or civilized, barbaric or enlightened. But humans don't exist in binary states. We're contradictory, adaptive, and contextual. She walked closer to the Centaurian delegate, noting how his massive form shifted nervously as she approached. You evolved on a world where threats were simple and solutions were straightforward. Run from danger, find safety, reproduce, repeat. Your nervous system is optimized for clear choices. Then she turned to the vegan representative. Your species developed in an environment of abundance where cooperation always provided better outcomes than conflict. Your brain chemistry literally prevents you from understanding situations where violence might be the optimal choice. The Alteran delegate's compound eyes tracked her movement with the precision of a predator or prey. And humans? Jessica's grin was fierce with pride. Humans evolved on a world that tried to kill us in every possible way. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, predators, diseases, resource scarcity, climate change. We survived by being adaptable enough to be peaceful when peace worked and savage when savage was necessary. She stopped in the center of the judgment circle, addressing the full assembly. You want to know about barbarism? Real barbarism isn't using violence when it's necessary. Real barbarism is refusing to use violence when innocents are dying because you're too comfortable with your moral superiority to soil your hands. The chamber fell into absolute silence. Even the soft hum of life support systems seemed muted, as if the station itself was holding its breath. On Kepler 442b, Jessica continued, her voice cutting through the silence like a weapon. I had a choice. I could follow your civilized protocols, attempt extended negotiations while researchers died, wait for diplomatic solutions while innocents suffered, maintain ecological balance while sentient beings were systematically hunted. She gestured toward the assembled delegates. Or I could do what was necessary to save lives, accept the moral complexity of my choices, and live with the consequences. The Danubian collective's patterns of bioluminescence had shifted to colors none of the other species had seen before, their group consciousness processing concepts that challenged their fundamental understanding of ethics and necessity. You call me savage, Jessica said, her voice growing stronger, more commanding. You call me barbaric. You question whether humans have evolved enough to deserve a place in your civilized galaxy. Her eyes moved across the assembly, meeting the gaze of each delegate in turn. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. But when your worlds are threatened, when your people are dying, when your civilized solutions have failed, you don't call the vegans, You don't call the Centaurians? You don't call the Alterans?" She paused, letting the truth settle over them like a shroud. "You call the humans. You call the savages. Because deep down, you know that sometimes savage is exactly what the situation requires." The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft sounds of various species' breathing apparatus and the subtle shifts in posture that indicated deep emotional processing. The Zephyrian Prime Minister's crystalline form had become almost transparent, a sign that her consciousness was working through complex calculations that challenged her species' fundamental worldview. Finally, the Centaurian delegate spoke, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "Commander Rice, are you saying that your actions on Kepler 442b were justified because the alternative was to allow deaths to occur?" Jessica nodded slowly. "I'm saying that moral perfection is a luxury that costs lives. Every moment I spent considering the ecological impact of my decisions was time that researchers were dying in those tunnels. Every second I debated the philosophical implications of violence was another irreplaceable life lost." She walked toward the holographic display, her movements carrying the fluid grace of someone always prepared for combat. "You want to analyze barbarism? Let me show you what barbarism really looks like." The display shifted again, showing new footage, not from Kepler 442b, but from the Rigel Station incident 3 years earlier. The images were grainy, taken from security cameras during what the official reports had classified as a terrorist incident. Rigel Station was a joint research facility, Jessica began, her voice taking on the clinical tone of a military briefing. 14 different species working together on quantum communication projects. The attack came from a group calling themselves the Pure Galaxy Coalition, extremists who believed that faster-than-light communication would lead to unwanted cultural contamination. The footage showed figures in dark clothing moving through corridors lined with laboratories and living quarters. The attackers moved with purpose, carrying weapons that were clearly designed to inflict maximum casualties. "They didn't target military installations or government facilities," Jessica continued. "They targeted researchers, teachers, students, civilians whose only crime was trying to advance knowledge that would benefit all species." The display focused on a particular section of the station, a residential area where families lived while conducting long-term research projects. The attackers had used some kind of gas weapon that was specifically designed to affect multiple respiratory systems simultaneously. By the time the Defense Force received the distress signal, 68 beings were already dead, Jessica said, her voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of controlled fury. The station's security forces had been eliminated in the first wave of attacks. The automated defense systems had been hacked and disabled. She gestured toward the screen, where a younger version of herself could be seen moving through smoke-filled corridors. "I was part of a 4-person rapid response team. Our orders were to secure the station and evacuate survivors." The footage showed Jessica and her team moving with military precision, checking rooms systematically. But something was wrong. The corridors were too quiet, the damage too extensive, the smoke too thick. The Pure Galaxy Coalition had rigged the station's life support systems to fail gradually, Jessica explained. They wanted the deaths to be slow, painful, and highly visible as a message to other multi-species cooperation efforts. The camera followed Jessica as she entered a laboratory where a group of survivors had barricaded themselves behind overturned tables and equipment. The beings inside were from 6 different species, researchers and their families who had managed to avoid the initial attack but were now trapped in a section of the station where the air recycling systems were failing. Standard evacuation protocols would have taken 40 minutes, Jessica said. The survivors had maybe 10 minutes of breathable air remaining. The display showed Jessica making a decision that clearly violated several safety regulations. Instead of waiting for proper equipment, she began dismantling the laboratory's chemical storage systems, combining compounds in ways that were definitely not covered in the official manuals. What I did was create a localized atmospheric processor using industrial solvents and medical oxygen supplies, Jessica explained. It was dangerous, unstable, and had a high probability of explosive failure. The Alteran delegate's compound eyes focused on the display with disturbing intensity. The risk of chemical explosion in an enclosed space was approximately 30%, Jessica finished. The certainty of death from asphyxiation was 100%. The choice was obvious. The footage showed the improvised atmospheric processor working, barely. Smoke cleared from the sealed laboratory as the survivors began to breathe more easily, but the device was visibly unstable, sparking and overheating in ways that made everyone in the chamber unconsciously lean away from the display. While the processor bought us time, I had to deal with the coalition forces that were still active in other sections of the station, Jessica continued. The display shifted to show her moving alone through darkened corridors, tracking the attackers who were systematically eliminating any remaining survivors. The coalition members were well-trained and heavily armed, Jessica said. Standard military doctrine would have been to call for reinforcements and establish a defensive perimeter until support arrived. The Vegan representative's scales had shifted to deep orange, alarm and curiosity in equal measure. But you didn't follow standard doctrine. Jessica's smile was sharp with predatory satisfaction. I hunted them. The footage showed Jessica moving through the station like a ghost, using maintenance shafts and utility corridors to approach the coalition forces from unexpected angles. Her movements were fluid, silent, and utterly lethal. The coalition had made a fundamental error in judgment, Jessica explained, her voice carrying a note of professional appreciation. They assumed that their opponents would fight defensively, trying to protect fixed positions and minimize casualties. The display showed the moment when Jessica encountered the first coalition patrol. Instead of engaging them directly, she had rigged a section of corridor with improvised traps, exposed power cables that created electric barriers, redirected steam from damaged pipes that obscured vision and burned exposed skin, and modified gravity plates that created unstable footing. They were prepared to fight soldiers, Jessica said. They weren't prepared to be hunted by someone who understood that the station itself could be turned into a weapon. The coalition forces in the footage were clearly struggling to adapt. Their military training was sophisticated but conventional. Jessica's approach was anything but conventional. She used the station's systems against them, turning their advantages into vulnerabilities. By the time I had neutralized the active threat, Jessica said, the atmospheric processor had stabilized enough to begin full evacuation procedures. All 43 survivors were successfully evacuated with no additional casualties. The Zephyrian Prime Minister's form had regained some solidity, but the stress patterns were still visible. Commander Rice, the methods you describe, hunting sentient beings, using the environment as a weapon, these actions seem to confirm the accusations of barbarism. Jessica's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, a subtle straightening that suggested dangerous attention. Prime Minister, would you like to know what barbarism actually looks like? Without waiting for permission, she activated another display sequence. This footage was different, cleaner, more professional, clearly taken by official recording equipment rather than security cameras. This is footage from the Tau Ceti colony, Jessica said. 6 months after the Rigel Station incident, the Pure Galaxy Coalition targeted a civilian settlement. This time, they used methods that your civilized protocols would consider acceptable. The new display showed a pristine colony world with carefully planned settlements scattered across fertile valleys. The architecture was typical of multi-species colonies, modular structures that could accommodate different atmospheric and gravitational needs, connected by transit systems that minimized environmental impact. The coalition had learned from Rigel Station, Jessica continued, her voice taking on a clinical detachment that somehow made her words more chilling. Instead of direct assault, they used what your civilized protocols would call acceptable methods. The footage showed coalition forces establishing positions around the colony's perimeter. Their weapons were different this time: energy dampeners that disabled technology without causing direct physical harm, sonic disruptors that induced unconsciousness rather than death, containment fields that trapped victims without visible injury. They followed the civilized conduct protocols perfectly, Jessica said, her tone carrying bitter irony. No unnecessary violence, minimal environmental disruption, careful attention to avoiding collateral damage to non-sentient life forms. The display showed colonists being systematically rounded up and transported to containment facilities that had been constructed according to galactic standards for prisoner treatment. The facilities included appropriate atmospheric controls, adequate nutrition supplies, and medical care that met multi-species requirements. The Coalition's plan was elegant in its civilized brutality, Jessica explained. They would hold the colonists indefinitely in conditions that met all legal requirements for humane treatment. No torture, no executions, no overt cruelty, just imprisonment, forever. The Denebian collective's bioluminescent patterns shifted to colors that indicated deep distress. Their group consciousness allowed them to process the full implications of prolonged captivity in ways that individual minds might struggle to comprehend. The psychological effects were precisely calculated, Jessica continued. Separation from families, isolation from familiar environments, the slow erosion of hope as months turned to years with no possibility of rescue or release. The footage showed the interior of the containment facilities. The conditions were technically adequate, clean, safe, providing all necessary life support. But the beings inside moved with the listless despair of creatures whose spirits had been systematically broken. By civilized standards, the Coalition had committed no crimes, Jessica said. They had used non-lethal methods, provided adequate care for their prisoners, and caused minimal environmental disruption. Their actions fell within the legal parameters established by this very council. The Centaurian delegates' massive form shifted uncomfortably, but imprisonment without cause was justified under their interpretation of galactic security protocols, Jessica interrupted. They claimed the colonists were potential vectors for cultural contamination that threatened species purity. Under Section 847 of the Galactic Security Code, temporary detention for biological and cultural assessment is legally permissible. The Alteran delegates' mandibles clicked in agitation. Temporary detention cannot be extended indefinitely. Can't it? Jessica asked. How long is temporary? The legal code doesn't specify. The Coalition could have held those prisoners for decades while conducting thorough assessments of their cultural impact potential. She gestured toward the display. This is what civilized barbarism looks like: clean, legal, sustainable, and absolutely devastating to the victims. The footage shifted to show Jessica and her team arriving at the Tau Ceti system, but this time her approach was different. Instead of the lightning-fast assault they had witnessed from Kepler 442b and Rigel Station, the recording showed careful, methodical preparation. The Defense Force Command wanted me to negotiate, Jessica said. Establish diplomatic contact with the Coalition, attempt to resolve the situation through peaceful dialogue, follow proper protocols for prisoner release negotiations. The display showed weeks of back-and-forth communications, formal diplomatic exchanges conducted through proper channels. The Coalition was perfectly willing to engage in discussions. They had confidence in the legal foundation of their actions and no urgency to resolve the situation. While we were negotiating, Jessica said, her voice growing harder, the prisoners were dying, not from violence or neglect, but from despair. Beings who had spent their lives building something beautiful were watching their life's work become meaningless. Parents were separated from children. Partners were isolated from each other. The footage showed the interior of the containment facilities again, but now the camera focused on individual faces. The despair was visible in expressions that transcended species barriers, the universal look of hope slowly being crushed by the weight of endless captivity. After 6 weeks of civilized negotiation, Jessica said, 17 prisoners had died from what the medical reports classified as failure to thrive. Their bodies were healthy, their physical needs were met, but their spirits had been broken. The vegan representative's scales had shifted through several color phases, finally settling on a deep purple that indicated profound emotional distress. But surely diplomatic solutions were exactly what the coalition wanted, Jessica finished. Every day of negotiation was another day of psychological torture for the prisoners. Every diplomatic protocol we followed gave the coalition more time to break the spirits of innocent beings. The display showed Jessica making a decision that was clearly against her orders. Instead of continuing the diplomatic process, she began planning a rescue operation that would violate numerous treaties and protocols. I studied the containment facilities for 3 days, Jessica said. The coalition had designed them to be impregnable by civilized standards, energy shields that deflected weapons, automated defenses that would trigger if anyone approached with hostile intent, containment fields that would prevent any prisoner from escaping. The footage showed Jessica and her team conducting reconnaissance from positions that seemed impossible, underwater approaches, underground tunnels, aerial infiltration routes that required dangerous climbing across sheer cliff faces. But the coalition had made the same mistake that most civilized species make, Jessica continued, her voice carrying a note of predatory satisfaction. They had assumed their opponents would fight according to the same rules they followed. The rescue operation that followed was unlike anything the assembled delegates had seen in their diplomatic careers. Jessica's approach wasn't the precise military action they might have expected. It was something far more unsettling. The coalition's containment facilities were designed to repel direct assault, Jessica explained, as the footage showed her team moving through terrain that seemed impossible to traverse. So I didn't assault them directly. Instead, the display showed a series of actions that seemed disconnected at first. Jessica's team positioned themselves at various points around the facilities, but none of them appeared to be attacking. Instead, they were waiting. The facilities required constant power input to maintain the containment fields, Jessica said. That power came from geothermal taps that the coalition had installed in the planet's volcanic systems. The footage showed Jessica descending into steam-filled caverns deep beneath the planet's surface. The environment was hostile in ways that most species couldn't survive. Temperatures that would cook unprotected flesh, atmospheric pressures that would crush normal bones, toxic gases that would dissolve standard breathing apparatus. Human thermal regulation systems are more adaptable than most species realize, Jessica explained, her voice carrying professional pride. We evolved on a world with extreme climate variations. Our bodies can function in environments that would kill more specialized species. The display showed Jessica working alone in conditions that looked like the inside of an active volcano. She was modifying the geothermal taps, not destroying them, but altering their output in subtle ways that would take hours to become apparent. The coalition's power systems were designed with multiple redundancies, Jessica said. Simply cutting power would have triggered emergency protocols that would have sealed the facilities and activated backup life support systems that could operate for months. Instead, Jessica had done something far more sophisticated. The modifications she made would cause the power systems to fluctuate in patterns that would appear to be natural geological variations. The containment fields would weaken gradually, creating opportunities for escape that would look like system malfunctions rather than sabotage. While I was modifying the power systems, Jessica continued, my team was establishing communication with the prisoners using methods that the coalition's monitoring systems couldn't detect. The footage showed her team members positioned at various points around the facilities, using reflected light signals that bounced off natural rock formations. The signals were too brief and too random-looking to register as communication, but they followed patterns that intelligent beings could recognize and interpret. "We taught the prisoners a simple escape protocol," Jessica explained. "When the containment fields fluctuated, specific prisoners would move to predetermined positions. They wouldn't try to escape immediately. That would have triggered alarms. Instead, they would position themselves to help others escape." The plan that emerged from the footage was breathtakingly complex. As the power fluctuations began, prisoners moved through the facilities in carefully coordinated patterns. Each successful movement enabled the next phase of escapes, creating a cascade effect that accelerated as more prisoners reached positions where they could assist others. "The coalition's response was predictable," Jessica said, as the display showed guards rushing to contain what appeared to be a spontaneous mass escape attempt. They activated emergency protocols, sealed facility sections, and called for reinforcements. But the coalition forces were reacting to symptoms rather than causes. Every time they contained one group of escaping prisoners, power fluctuations would create new opportunities elsewhere. The guards found themselves constantly responding to crises without understanding the underlying pattern. The beauty of the plan, Jessica explained, was that it used the coalition's own civilized protocols against them. Their rules required them to maintain minimum standards of prisoner care, which limited how harshly they could respond to escape attempts. The footage showed coalition forces struggling with decisions that their training hadn't prepared them for. They could use non-lethal force to recapture prisoners, but their own protocols prevented them from using methods that might cause permanent injury. Their weapons were designed to disable rather than kill, which gave the prisoners multiple opportunities to attempt escape. Within 6 hours, Jessica said, 437 of the original prisoners had successfully evacuated the facilities. The remaining prisoners were freed when the coalition forces abandoned the containment sites to pursue the escaped groups. The Zephyrian Prime Minister's crystalline form showed stress patterns that indicated she was struggling to process what she had witnessed. "Commander Rice, the complexity of this operation, the advanced planning, the coordination, the manipulation of both technological and psychological factors, this suggests capabilities far beyond what our assessments of human intelligence have indicated." Jessica's smile was sharp with satisfaction. "Your assessments have been based on the assumption that human intelligence works the same way as other species. You've been measuring us against standards that don't account for our adaptability." She gestured toward the display, which now showed the aftermath of the Tau Ceti rescue. The coalition forces were in complete disarray, their carefully planned operation transformed into chaos by methods they hadn't anticipated. "Humans don't just solve problems," Jessica continued. "We solve problems while simultaneously dealing with changing conditions, resource limitations, time constraints, and opposition from intelligent adversaries. We evolved to think tactically, strategically, and adaptively all at the same time." The Arcturian observer systems had been running continuous analysis throughout the presentation. Its translated voice carried a new tone of something that might have been respect. The human cognitive architecture appears to be optimized for complex, multivariable problem-solving in hostile environments. "We call it thinking on your feet," Jessica replied. "But it's more than that. It's the ability to maintain multiple simultaneous plans, adapt to changing circumstances, and execute complex operations while under stress." The Denebian collective's patterns had shifted to colors that indicated not just understanding, but a kind of awe. Their group consciousness allowed them to appreciate the full complexity of what Jessica had accomplished, but their collective nature made such individual adaptability literally incomprehensible to them. "The question," Jessica said, addressing the full assembly, "isn't whether humans are barbaric. The question is whether the galaxy can afford to lose access to capabilities that no other species possesses." She walked closer to the assembled delegates, her movement carrying the fluid confidence of someone who had faced impossible odds and survived. You've spent this entire proceeding trying to judge human methods by standards that were developed by species who never had to make the choices humans make. The Centaurian delegate's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, confusion mixed with dawning realization. You're suggesting that our standards are inadequate? I'm suggesting that your standards are irrelevant, Jessica replied bluntly. You've created ethical frameworks based on the luxury of safety, the assumption of abundant resources, and the availability of unlimited time for careful consideration. She gestured toward the holographic displays that had shown the 3 rescue operations. But the universe doesn't always provide luxury. Sometimes there are situations where perfect solutions don't exist, where every choice has moral costs, where delay means death. The Alteran delegate's compound eyes tracked her movement with predatory intensity. But surely some standards must be maintained. Must they? Jessica interrupted. When your colony ships encounter unknown dangers, do you want the rescue teams to follow your philosophical standards, or do you want them to bring your people home alive? The question hung in the chamber like a challenge. The assembled delegates had spent centuries building civilizations based on the assumption that intelligence and morality could solve any problem given sufficient time and resources. But Jessica's presentation had shown them situations where time was the one resource that wasn't available. You call me savage, Jessica said, her voice growing stronger, more commanding. You call me barbaric. You question whether humans deserve a place in your civilized galaxy. Her eyes moved across the assembly, meeting the gaze of each delegate in turn. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. But when the Pure Galaxy Coalition took your researchers hostage, when the Keplerian Ravagers threatened your scientists, when unknown dangers threaten your people in the dark spaces between stars, you don't call the civilized species. She paused, letting the truth settle over them like a mantle of responsibility. You call the humans. You call the barbarians. You call the savages. Jessica's stance shifted slightly, her weight settling into a position that suggested both readiness and absolute confidence. Because deep down, beneath all your civilized philosophy and moral superiority, you understand something that you don't want to admit. The chamber fell into absolute silence. Sometimes, Jessica said, her voice cutting through the quiet like a weapon, savage is exactly what the universe requires. And when that moment comes, you want someone who doesn't fear the word, someone who survived by embracing it. She stood alone in the center of the judgment circle, surrounded by representatives of 47 species who had spent the morning condemning her methods and questioning her morality. But now the condemnation had transformed into something else, recognition, perhaps even fear, of a truth they had been trying to avoid. The Zephyrian Prime Minister's crystalline form had achieved perfect stability, the stress fractures healed, her consciousness apparently reaching some kind of resolution. When she spoke, her musical voice carried a weight that indicated formal decision. Commander Rice, she said, this council withdraws its charges of barbarism. Jessica's expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested she had been expecting this outcome. Furthermore, the Prime Minister continued, this council formally recognizes that human military methods, while unconventional by our standards, have consistently achieved results that serve the greater good of galactic civilization. A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembly. The vote, when it came, was unanimous, 47 species formally acknowledging that human barbarism was not only acceptable but necessary for the survival of their civilized galaxy. As the session ended and the delegates began to file out of the chamber, Jessica remained in the judgment circle, watching them go. The Centaurian delegate paused as he passed her, his massive head turning to meet her gaze. Commander Rice, he said, his voice carrying new respect, I believe I understand now why your species calls itself human. It means embracing the contradictions, doesn't it? Jessica's smile was fierce with pride. "No," she replied. "It means surviving by any means necessary and living with the consequences." As the chamber emptied, Jessica stood alone in the space where she had been judged and found. Necessary. The word savage no longer felt like an accusation. It felt like recognition, acknowledgement of what humans were, what they had always been, and what the galaxy needed them to continue being. Outside the crystalline walls, the vast complexity of galactic civilization continued its ancient dance of politics and philosophy, ethics and ideology. But when the dance was threatened, when the complex systems failed, when civilization itself hung in the balance, they would call the humans. They would call the savages. And Jessica Rice would answer,